Have you ever believed something so deeply, something you were taught as, absolute fact, only to discover it was built on shifting sands?
It happens.
Yeah, and that's the kind of mind-bending historical journey we're taking you on today. A detective story, really, that challenges a century-old understanding of an entire civilization.
It's quite a profound shift, actually.
Mm,
It forces us to reevaluate how these historical narratives get constructed in the first place.
right.
And what happens when these long-accepted truths face powerful new scrutiny.
Absolutely. So today, we're embarking on a deep dive into the complex history of ancient Burma. We're specifically confronting what's known as the Mon Paradigm.
Mm.
This was a really long-held theory, and it significantly shaped how we understood, well, the origins of Burmese culture and the relationships between its major ethnic groups.
It really did set the stage for a lot of subsequent interpretation.
So our mission today is to unpack the evidence, maybe uncover how these powerful narratives are built, and see what truly happened when the historical mists, as our source calls them, cleared.
And speaking of our source, our guide for this deep dive is a truly groundbreaking academic work, The Mists of Rāmaññadesa, The Legend That Was Lower Burma, by Michael A. Ong Thwin.
Fantastic title.
Isn't it? And the book meticulously scrutinizes centuries of sources. I mean, everything from archaeological discoveries, ancient inscriptions, to Chinese historical accounts, local chronicles, the works.
Wow.
Yeah, and it reconstructs a very, very different picture of the past. So we're going to walk you through its most compelling revelations.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Before we dive into the new findings, we probably need to understand the theory that was dominant for so long. What was the core claim of this Mon Paradigm?
Right. So at its heart, the Mon Paradigm asserted that the Mon people and their culture down in Lower Burma were the ultimate source for Bagan civilization up in Upper Burma.
And Bagan, just for context, that's seen as the golden age of Burmese culture, right?
Exactly. The absolute peak, culturally speaking, in many traditional accounts.
And this wasn't just, like, some influence, was it? The paradigm basically gave the Mon credit for almost everything that made Pagan, well, Pagan.
Precisely. It wasn't subtle. It attributed nearly every significant cultural and technological aspect of Pagan directly to Mon influence.
Such as?
Well, okay, its form of Orthodox Buddhism, specifically the Mahavihara school, which is a key lineage tracing back to Sri Lanka. Also, indigenous spiritual elements like the cult of the 37 Nats. Those are the traditional Burmese spirits. Leadership ideologies, even specific patron saints like Upagupta, Maitreya, Gavam, Dapati.
Okay, so religion, spirituality. What
Now
else?
it goes on. The Mon were said to be the originators of Pagan's writing system, its fine arts, the really distinctive temple architecture you see there, literature, and even advanced irrigation technology. Basically, the whole civilizational toolkit.
So a truly comprehensive civilizing force. And it was all supposed to have culminated under one specific king.
Exactly that. King Dhammazedi. He's a very celebrated figure in Burmese history, and he was portrayed as having almost single-handedly implemented this entire civilizing process during what they called a Mon period at Pagan.
So that story became foundational.
Absolutely foundational for how Burma's development was understood for a very long time.
Now, what's really fascinating here, and maybe a bit of a cautionary tale for historians, is how deeply ingrained this paradigm became. Why was it so incredibly difficult to challenge?
Well, it wasn't just conceptually difficult, though it was that too. It was methodologically really complex because it was so thoroughly woven into so many different academic disciplines.
Like what?
You're talking archaeology, history, art history, epigraphy, that's the study of inscriptions,
Right.
paleography, the study of ancient writing, and linguistics. So because it touched all these fields, it created this powerful impression of a broad, interdisciplinary consensus.
Ah, so it seemed like everyone agreed, making it seem almost untouchable.
Exactly. It gained this sort of unshakable authority.
So it was almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You mentioned the author calls it a tautological trap.
That's a perfect description. The core premise that this ancient Mon-dominated kingdom, Rāmaññadesa, existed down in Lower Burma, it led to a kind of circular reasoning.
How so?
Well, basically, any artifact found in Lower Burma was automatically assumed to be Mon, and automatically assumed to be earlier than anything found up in Upper Burma.
Ah.
And if contradictory evidence popped up, evidence that didn't fit, it was often just rationalized away, labeled improbable or maybe unreliable,
Yeah.
conveniently sidelined.
And it sounds like even some early scholars might have had their doubts, but they couldn't really break free from this cycle.
That's right. There were early archaeologists like DuPont who wasn't even a specialist in Burma, interestingly, who objectively noted discrepancies in the evidence they were finding. But he lacked the necessary linguistic tools, especially knowledge of Old Burmese, to really dig deeper and challenge the prevailing interpretations. And crucially, there was extensive archaeological data pointing to the presence of another culture entirely, the Pyu, who were there for a whole millennium. But this evidence was acknowledged only superficially because the Mon Paradigm was just so utterly dominant. It overshadowed everything else.
Okay, this is where Ong Thwin's work gets really interesting, isn't it? His key methodological shift sounds simple but profound, just re-examining all the evidence outside the analytical framework of the Mon Paradigm.
Exactly. It sounds obvious in hindsight, maybe, but it was revolutionary at the time.
So what did that reveal? What was the big discovery when you looked at the data fresh without those Mon assumptions?
Well, by simply not assuming a chronological or cultural link between stuff found in Lower Burma and Mon speakers, an entirely new picture started to emerge. And what the author found was, frankly, remarkable. Neither the old Mon inscriptions themselves nor the earliest Mon texts from Burma actually supported the Mon paradigm at all.
Wow. So the Mon sources themselves didn't back it up?
Not the early ones, no. In fact, the history of the Mon in Lower Burma, as told by the Mon themselves in their later records, aligns much better with the archaeology, the art history, the epigraphy, the chronicles, even the Chinese sources, and it completely contradicts the paradigm that had been built around them.
So what's the true narrative then, according to this new rigorous look at the evidence? What are the key takeaways?
Okay, first major revelation. There is no evidence, zero, for a significant Mon kingdom, or frankly any other major kingdom, in Lower Burma before the rise of Bagan in Upper Burma.
Okay, so no ancient Mon kingdom there. What else?
Second, there's no support for that famous story of King Aniruddha conquering Thaton, the supposed Mon capital.
Right, the story where he supposedly brought back Mon scholars and texts.
That one, no evidence for it,
Yeah.
and therefore no support for the idea that Upper Burma was civilized by Lower Burma through that conquest.
So the exact opposite of what we've been taught for a century. That's a complete historical flip.
It really is, a 180-degree turn. Primary evidence. The inscriptions, the archaeology overwhelmingly suggests it was the kingdom of Bagan from Upper Burma that actually drove the demographic growth, the cultural development, and the infrastructure building in Lower Burma.
So Bagan developed Lower Burma, not the other way around.
Yes. This area, Lower Burma, which was previously a sparsely populated sort of frontier region, only began to coalesce into an independent political entity much later, in the late 13th century.
Right.
So if anything, it was Upper Burma that profoundly shaped and you could say civilized Lower Burma in this early period.
Okay, this brings us to Burma's true early civilizers then, these previously overlooked people. Who were they? Tell us about the Pyu.
Right, the Pyu, P-Y-U. They were Tibeto-Burman speakers, so related linguistically to the later Burmese, and they inhabited the area we now call Burma during the pre-Pagan millennium. We're talking roughly from the 2nd century BC up to the early 9th century AD.
1,000 years.
A huge span of time. And the name Pyu itself actually comes from the Chinese. It's the Cantonese pronunciation of a character, piao, that the Chinese used to refer to this culture and people.
And these weren't just scattered villages, right? What were their settlements like, their urban centers?
Oh, far from it. They lived in large, sophisticated, walled urban centers, mainly concentrated in the Irrawaddy Valley's dry zone. Places like Beikthano, which goes back to the 2nd century BC. There was continuous urban settlement in these key areas right up to the founding of Bagan.
You mentioned Hanlin earlier.
Yes, Hanlin is a key site. Radiocarbon dates show it actually preceded another major Pyu city, Sri Lanka, by nearly 6 centuries. It had wooden gates dated as early as 70 AD and evidence of continuous activity right up until 870 AD.
What was it like?
It was a substantial rectangular city, actually much larger than Beikthano. It had 12 gates, which often has symbolic Hindu-Buddhist significance, and excavations there. They've yielded a really rich material culture. Distinctive Pyu coins.
Coins are always good evidence.
Definitely. Also, gold and onyx beads, burial urns suggesting specific funerary practices, iron tools, and these characteristic finger-marked bricks, which are also found down in Lower Burma Pyu sites, interestingly.
And Sri Lanka. You said that was even bigger.
Sri Lanka was indeed the largest known Pyu urban area. Massive walled city, over 8 miles in circumference, also with 12 gates.
Wow.
And the finds there show extensive evidence of both Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism. You get Buddha statues in various postures, bodhisattva figures like Avalokiteshvara, There's also evidence of Brahmanism, like Vishnu figures.
And wasn't there a really crucial manuscript found there?
Yes, absolutely crucial. A 5th or maybe 7th century manuscript made of gold leaves, inscribed with Pali texts.
Pali, the language of the Theravada scriptures.
Exactly. Texts from fundamental Buddhist scriptures like the Abhidhamma and the Vinaya, written in the Pew script. This is direct, tangible proof of early Theravada Buddhism thriving among the Pew, centuries before Bagan really hits its stride.
So what's the Pew legacy then? How did they influence what came after them, the Burmese speakers who founded Bagan?
Their legacy is profound, and it was largely ignored or misattributed under the Mon Paradigm. For instance, the main Burmese dating system, the Lesser Era, or Kusakaraj, which starts in 638 AD,
Yes.
that was actually used by the Pew centuries before Burmese speakers even appeared significantly on the scene. It was sometimes even called the Pew era.
No kidding.
Yeah, their writing system, borrowed directly from India, likely South India, and the Pew passed on their script, their system of patronymic names linking generations, their arts, their architecture, conceptual systems like urban planning, all directly to the Burmese speakers who succeeded them in the region.
So a clear line of indigenous development.
Exactly, a clear indigenous historical continuity from Pew to Burmese, and even though the main Pew kingdom's decline, probably due to Nanzhao incursions from the north in the 9th century, their former cities like Hanlin and Sri Lanka remained important political and economic centers for the emerging Burmese state at Bagan.
That's a huge shift in our understanding. Okay, so we've established the Pew's foundational role. Now, let's go back and really deconstruct the specific historical claims that form the backbone of the Mon Paradigm. Let's start with the very idea of an ancient Mon kingdom called Rāmaññadesa and its supposed capital, Thaton. What's the truth there, according to Ongthwin?
Well, the striking thing here is the complete lack of contemporary evidence. There's simply no external record, not Chinese, not Indian, not Arab, that mentions any significant political entity in Lower Burma before the late 13th century.
None at all.
None, and maybe even more telling. Not a single indigenous inscription found in Burma itself mentions the name Rāmaññadesa, or Thaton, before the 15th century.
The 15th century, that's centuries after they were supposed to exist and be conquered.
Exactly. It completely undermines the idea of their ancient origins.
And the geography of the region itself played a role too, right? It wasn't exactly prime real estate for a major kingdom back then.
That's another key point. Before Bagan expanded downwards and invested in infrastructure like drainage and irrigation, much of Lower Burma was likely quite sparsely inhabited. It was swampy, a kind of frontier zone.
Difficult terrain.
Very. Geographers even suggest the specific area around Thaton might have actually been under the ocean for parts of this early period. And the surrounding hinterland just didn't have the agricultural base or population density to support a major kingdom of the scale claimed by the paradigm.
So how on earth did this idea of an ancient Rāmaññadesa become so entrenched if there's no early evidence for it? It sounds like someone later invented it.
That's essentially what the evidence points to.
Yeah.
It seems to have been King Dhammazedi of Pegu, ruling in the 15th century, who really crafted this narrative.
How did he do that?
Primarily through his famous Kalyani inscriptions. These are large stone inscriptions that became incredibly influential. In these and other texts, he deliberately links Suven Kubmi, the legendary golden land from Buddhist lore, which original accounts often placed elsewhere, like India or the Indonesian archipelago.
Right.
He linked that legendary place specifically with Lower Burma. And he essentially conflated or merged figures and events from totally different time periods, centuries apart, like the merchants Balika and Tapusa who met the Buddha, and the later missionaries Sutta and Uttara to give his own kingdom of Pegu, which he called Rāmaññadesa, and invented ahistorical antiquity and a sacred Buddhist status.
Ah, so it was about legitimizing his own rule in the 15th century.
Precisely. Creating a prestigious ancient lineage for his kingdom. It was kind of messianic time approach, projecting current needs back onto the past. And unfortunately, colonial scholars later picked up this narrative and ran with it, accepting it as historical fact.
Fascinating. Okay, shifting gears slightly, let's talk about King Khinzitha again. He's this central figure, celebrated as the champion of Mon culture, and his Mon period at Bagan is legendary. What's the new take on his story?
Well, the popular story about Khinzitha, his supposed Mon background, his partiality for Mon culture, the whole Mon period, it turns out, upon closer examination of the sources, to be largely an adaptation of well-known Jataka tales. Those are the Buddha's birth stories.
Right.
Or possibly legends about the great Indian Buddhist emperor Ashoka. These existing stories seem to have been simply recontextualized into Burmese history, functioning more as a Buddhist allegory about kingship and piety rather than a literal historical account of his reign or ethnic identity.
So not literal history. And how did prominent scholars who supported the paradigm, like G.H. Luce, handle evidence that contradicted this story about Khansitha?
It's quite revealing. For example, Luce apparently dismissed an actual inscription dated 1107 AD, right during Khansitha's reign, which clearly stated the king's birthplace was Tilinang, not Kyaukse, the area traditionally linked with the Mon in Upper Burma.
He dismissed contemporary evidence.
Yes, preferring instead to rely on later, undated inscriptions that don't even mention Khansitha by name, simply because they fit the established narrative better. It shows how powerful the paradigm's grip was.
And what about the language aspect? The paradigm suggested significant Mon influence on the Burmese language during his reign. Is there evidence for that?
Surprisingly little, actually. There's scant evidence of significant Mon words being borrowed into the Burmese language during Khansitha's specific reign. Even the term Rāmañña, which is the Burmese word for the Mon people, doesn't even appear in Upper Burma inscriptions until 1102 AD.
Which is well into Khansitha's reign, but also much later than King Aniruddha, who supposedly conquered the Mon capital earlier.
Exactly. The timeline doesn't quite fit the narrative of a massive, sudden influx of Mon culture under Khansitha.
I also remember the argument about religious orthodoxy, that Aniruddha was somehow less orthodox than Khansitha, and this was shown by differences in the Jataka stories depicted on their respective temples. How does that hold up?
That argument also seems quite weak when you look closely. Research shows that the famous Ananda Temple, which is traditionally attributed to Khansitha and his supposed Mon piety,
Yes.
actually features the unorthodox set of 550 Janaka plaques, not the 547 associated with the orthodox Sinhalese Theravada tradition that the Mon were supposed to represent.
Oh, interesting.
And perhaps more importantly, the vast majority of Bagan temples don't have any Janaka plaques at all. So using the presence or specific number of these plaques as a primary measure of a king's religious orthodoxy seems like a very shaky foundation.
Fair enough. What about the Tipiyaka, the Buddhist scriptures themselves? Wasn't Khansitha credited with bringing the true, complete scriptures and thus proper orthodoxy to Burma from the Mon?
If you look at the Sinhalese chronicles of Mahavasa from Sri Lanka, which were influential whether you view them as strictly historical or partly allegorical, they actually seem to support the idea that it was Aniruddha's monks, the earlier king, who already possessed the complete Tipiyakas.
So contradicting the idea that Khansitha had to get them from the Mon.
Exactly. Contradicts Luce's claims and the paradigm's narrative that Khansitha was the one who brought truly orthodox, scripture-based Buddhism to Bagan via the Mon.
Okay, here's another really important claim, and one with very sensitive, lasting implications. This fabricated, downtrodden tailing myth. What did Onthwin uncover about this term and the narrative around it?
This is a particularly crucial and frankly damaging part of the old narrative. What the research shows is that there is simply no pre-colonial historical record, none whether it's Mon, Chinese, Arabic, or even Burmese sources that indicates the Mon people felt historically oppressed by the Burmese or that there was this inherent age-old animosity.
No evidence of that historical oppression narrative.
None in the pre-colonial sources. Even the early English reports from the late 18th and early 19th centuries by people like Symes or Cox, they observe interactions, but they do not use the term talang to imply enslavement or systemic oppression.
So where did this deeply problematic idea that talang meant downtrodden or slave actually come from?
It appears to have originated quite specifically with a colonial official named Dr. Emil Forchhammer in 1884. He proposed this etymology linking telling to a Pali word meaning trodden underfoot.
He just proposed it.
Yes, and this definition was then picked up and incorporated into the influential Judson's Burmese-English Dictionary by 1893. And crucially, it got linked retrospectively to the actions of the later Burmese king Alongpaya in the 18th century, framing his conquests as ethnically motivated oppression of the Telang.
And the word Telang itself, is it even a Mon word originally?
This is absolutely key. The word Telang is not found in any Old Mon or Middle Mon inscriptions, nor does it appear in any pre-colonial Mon chronicles written in Mon.
So the Mon didn't use it to refer to themselves?
No. It seems to be a term used only in or with reference to Burma, and it's clearly a word that came from outside the Mon language. It's exogenous. Modern linguists have looked at the supposed Mon etymologies proposed for Taling and confirmed they are simply not linguistically viable.
So essentially, it was a colonial era invention, or at least a colonial era interpretation and definition. And it sounds like it had a very specific strategic purpose for the colonizers.
Exactly. This myth, this interpretation, became institutionalized through colonial historiography, and its effect was to create, or at least greatly exaggerate, a narrative of perpetual ethnic animosity between Burmese and Mon.
Why would they do that?
Well, projecting this supposed ancient conflict backward in time served to justify their own colonial policies. First, things like divide and rule, playing groups off against each other. And later, it was used to support arguments for local autonomy for minority groups like the Mon, framing it as protection against the central Burmese power, which conveniently diverted attention from anti-colonial sentiment.
It's truly eye-opening to see how these ideas, even specific word definitions, could be constructed and then become so deeply ingrained. How was the Mon paradigm, with all these questionable foundations we've discussed, actually institutionalized by colonial scholars and administrators?
Well, by the early 20th century, colonial scholars had pretty much cemented the Mon paradigm's three core components as accepted historical fact. The supposed great antiquity of Rāmaññadesa, the story of Aniruddha's conquest of Thaton, and the idea that the Mon were responsible for civilizing Bagan.
How did it spread and become official?
Early English sources played a role. Michael Symes's journal from his embassy in 1802 was one of the first widely read English accounts to link the supposed Thaton conquest with its alleged civilizing effects on the Burmese.
Okay.
Then the discovery and translation of King Dhammazedi's Kalyani inscriptions in the late 19th century were huge. Because they contained that narrative about ancient Buddhist missions and linked Suvantehumi to Lower Burma, it seemed to confirm the antiquity and importance of the region in the minds of colonial scholars.
And I imagine academic journals and institutions played a significant role in solidifying this view.
Absolutely critical. Publications like the Journal of the Burma Research Society, founded in 1911, and the government-sponsored Epigraphia Burmanka series became the primary vehicles for publishing the research, translating the inscriptions, and essentially institutionalizing and perpetuating the Mon paradigm almost from their inception. It became the standard taught history.
So, beyond the specific academic arguments and interpretations of evidence, why do you think this paradigm persisted for so long, even when, as you mentioned, some contradictory evidence existed? Were there perhaps underlying biases or motivations at play among the colonial officials and scholars?
I think that's fair to say, and Ong Thwin discusses this too. Beyond the purely intellectual arguments, there seem to have been other factors. There was certainly a strong belief, common in that era, in ethnicity itself as a very tangible primordial force that shapes history.
Right, seeing history through an ethnic lens.
Yes. There also appears to have been a kind of sentimental attachment among some colonial figures to supporting people, the Monta, who were perceived through this lens as victimized or overshadowed by the majority Burmese.
A sort of underdog narrative.
Perhaps,
right.
Maybe also a genuine desire, in some cases, to preserve what they considered an ancient and distinct culture in a world that was rapidly changing under colonialism. Now, these motivations aren't necessarily bad in themselves,
Sure.
but they nevertheless seem to have played a significant role in unconsciously biasing the interpretation of evidence and cementing what we now understand was, in large part, a historical fiction.
So if the Mon paradigm, this idea of an ancient, influential Mon kingdom in Lower Burma, was largely fabricated, what was the actual reality of Lower Burma's development in that early period?
Well, the archaeological evidence is quite clear on this now. It shows no signs of any large-scale centralized polity or the foundations for one like major urban centers or extensive state infrastructure in Lower Burma's coastal regions before the expansion of cultures from the interior, namely Bagan.
So what drove the development there then?
It seems to have been Pagan's influence moving southward. Pagan had a more advanced agrarian economy, sophisticated state structures, things like the ability to pay artisans, organize labor for large building projects, settle crown soldiers on newly irrigated land to expand agriculture. It was this system, expanding from Upper Burma, that stimulated significant demographic growth and economic development, which then gradually extended into Lower Burma, transforming that frontier region.
So the true birth of Rāmaññadesa, the historical Mon kingdom that did eventually exist in Lower Burma, happened much, much later than the paradigm claimed.
Far, far later. The historical Mon kingdom that we do have evidence for in Lower Burma only really began to emerge in the late 13th century. Figures like Weru of Martaban are key here.
And why then? What was happening?
Well, this timing coincides directly with the weakening of the Pagan kingdom itself. which was facing pressure from Mongol incursions from the north and dealing with internal factionalism. This power vacuum allowed regional powers, like the one led by Weru in the south, to emerge.
So we're talking about 1,300 years after the mythical date claimed by the Mon Paradigm for Rāmaññadesa's origins.
Roughly, yes.
Yeah.
A huge discrepancy. And this later actual Mon-led Rāmaññadesa, based in Pegu, which lasted for about 200 years or so until it was conquered in the 16th century by Burmese speakers from Toungoo.
Yes.
That's the kingdom that most Western scholarship often recalls or focuses on, perhaps precisely because its later period coincided with the arrival of the first European accounts, Portuguese, Dutch, English. They documented that kingdom.
Ah, so the memory of the later real kingdom got conflated with the myth of the ancient one.
It seems very likely.
And just quickly, even King Alangpaya's 18th century reunification of Burma, which the colonial narrative often portrayed as an ethnic cleansing of the Talingman that wasn't primarily about ethnicity either.
Well, looking closely at Alangpaya's own edicts and actions, Onthwin argues it becomes clear that this was primarily a political power struggle aimed at unifying a fragmented country after the collapse of the previous dynasty. It wasn't fundamentally driven by ethnic hatred.
But he did use ethnic identity sometimes.
Yes. His use of a Burman ethnic card, so to speak, appears to have been more of a strategic political move to rally support among the majority population in Upper Burma during a time of civil war and competing power centers, rather than an indication of a premeditated policy of ethnic targeting or cleansing directed specifically at the Mon people as an ethnic group. The colonial interpretation flattened a complex political situation into a simple ethnic conflict.
So the enduring legacy of this entire historical construction, this Mon paradigm, is actually quite profound, isn't it? Shaping perceptions even today.
It truly is. The ethnic interpretation of Burma's history, which was so central to the Mon paradigm and heavily promoted during the colonial era, unfortunately remains a very dominant framework for understanding the country, both inside and outside Burma.
And the belief in deep-seated ethnic conflict.
Yes, the belief in inherent, enduring ethnic animosities within Burma, sadly, largely stems from this colonial construction. It subtly, or maybe not so subtly, shifted the historical narrative away from, say, anti-colonial struggles or political power dynamics and reframed much of Burma's history as primarily a story of internal ethnic conflict. A very consequential shift.
Wow. Well, you've just journeyed with us through a remarkable historical revision. We've unraveled really a century of accepted wisdom about ancient Burma.
We really have.
We've seen how rigorous archaeological evidence and a critical rereading of textual sources can dismantle these deeply entrenched narratives, revealing this Pew foundation that was largely ignored, and showing a much later emergence for what was long thought to be the ancient foundational Mon civilization of Lower Burma.
And this deep dive, I think, really highlights the incredible power of historical narratives themselves. You know, how they are meticulously constructed, sometimes consciously, sometimes not. How they can gain an almost sacred, unquestioned status, and how sometimes they are inadvertently or even deliberately shaped by contemporary biases, political agendas, or just the interpretive fashions of the time.
Absolutely. The story of ancient Burma really shows us how a historical mistake, or perhaps a deliberate construction, can go on to influence national identity, inter-ethnic relations, and even bite in political discourse for generations. The consequences are real.
They certainly are.
So this leaves us with a truly thought-provoking question, doesn't it? What other truths in history, or maybe even in our current understanding of the world around us right now, might be similar mists, just waiting to be cleared away by new evidence and fresh perspectives?
That's a crucial question.
What narratives are you, listening now, accepting perhaps without critical re-examination, and
Right.
what might be their real-world consequences? This deep dive is, I think, a powerful reminder to always question, always dig deeper.
And always, always seek the most robust evidence wherever it leads.